What if the men who changed the entire world were never supposed to be chosen at all? 12 ordinary men, fishermen, a traitor, a revolutionary, a man who would deny the Son of God 3 times and still become his greatest voice. This is not the story you were taught. There is a moment in history, so quiet, so unremarkable on the surface, that most people who witnessed it probably thought nothing of it. A man walked along the shore of a lake in northern Israel. He was not riding a horse. He carried no army behind him. He wore no crown, held no scroll of authority, and announced no great political campaign. He was simply walking, looking, watching men work with their hands, pulling nets from dark water, hauling fish, cursing at ropes that had tangled for the 3rd time that morning. And then he stopped. He looked at 2 brothers, sunburned, salt-stained, their arms built from years of hard labor, and he said something that would echo for the next 2,000 years. "Follow me." That was it. No long explanation, no written contract, no demonstration of power. Just 2 words spoken to 2 men who had every reason in the world to say no. And here is what will stop you cold if you think about it long enough. They went. Not after a week of consideration, not after consulting their families, reviewing the offer, or asking for more details. They dropped their nets right there in that moment, in the middle of a working morning, and they followed a man they barely knew. Why? That question has haunted scholars, theologians, and ordinary people for over 2,000 years. And the honest answer is one that most people never sit with long enough. We do not fully know. What we do know is this: those 2 brothers were not the only ones. Before the sun had moved very far across the sky, there were more. Different men, different backgrounds, different reasons for walking away from everything familiar. And together, these 12 men became the most unlikely, most improbable, most profoundly human group of people ever assembled around a single mission. Their story is not a story about perfect faith. It is a story about imperfect people who kept showing up anyway. And if that does not sound like your story, if that does not sound like the life of someone you love, then keep listening, because it will. Now, before we go any further, let us be honest about something. Most of us grew up with a version of the disciples that was cleaned up, polished, made safe for Sunday mornings. In the paintings, they look serene, patient, composed, like men who never raised their voices, never wrestled with God in the dark, never sat up at night wondering if they had made the biggest mistake of their lives. But the historical record, both sacred and secular, tells a completely different story. These were men who argued with each other about who was the greatest. Men who fell asleep when they were needed most. Men who ran away. Men who lied. Men who doubted the resurrection even after standing in an empty tomb. One of them, a man chosen, trusted, given the same access as all the others, would sell his teacher for the price of a common slave. And yet, these 12 men, in their broken, stumbling, very human way, carried a message across the ancient world that toppled empires, outlasted governments, and reached every continent on earth. So the question is not whether they were perfect. The question is, who were they really? Where did they come from? What did they believe before they met Jesus? What did following him actually cost them? And in the end, How did each of them die? Because the end of each story reveals something the beginning cannot. And before this video is over, you will know all of it. Chig. Let us start at the beginning. Not with the disciples themselves, but with a single night that most people have never heard about. Before Jesus chose anyone, he disappeared. He left the towns, the people who were pressing in on every side asking for healing and miracles and answers. And he walked up into the hills alone. And according to the Gospel of Luke, he spent the entire night in prayer. The entire night. Think about that. The man who would one day be recognized as the Son of God, the one who calmed storms with a word and raised the dead. He spent the night before choosing his disciples on his knees in conversation with the Father. He was not choosing celebrities. He was not recruiting the most educated, the most powerful, or the most respected voices in Israel. He was asking for guidance on who to call, and the answers he received would have surprised every religious leader in the country. Because when morning came and Jesus walked back down into the world, the men he chose were not what anyone expected. Chunk. Here is the first thing you need to understand about the world these men lived in. First century Israel was a place under enormous pressure. Rome controlled everything: the roads, the taxes, the courts, the military. Jewish people were living in their own homeland as a conquered people, and that tension created fractures that ran through every family, every neighborhood, every fishing village on the Sea of Galilee. Some people collaborated with Rome to survive. Others burned with hatred for every Roman soldier they passed on the street. Some retreated into religious purity, convinced that only strict obedience to the law could restore Israel's greatness. Others had given up entirely working their boats, hauling their fish, trying to stay invisible. Into this fractured, pressurized world, Jesus walked, and he chose men from every corner of it. Simon Peter and his brother Andrew, fishermen. Working men. Not scholars, not priests. Men with calloused hands and salt in their hair, who smelled like the lake they worked every day. James and John, also fishermen, but from a slightly more prosperous family. Their father Zebedee had hired workers, which meant they were not at the very bottom of the economic ladder, but they were not at the top either. Matthew, and here is where it gets complicated. Matthew was a tax collector, not just any tax collector. He worked for Rome. He sat at a booth on the road and collected money from his own people on behalf of the empire that occupied them. In that world, tax collectors were despised. They were considered traitors. Some of them charged more than they were supposed to and kept the difference. They were not invited to religious gatherings. They were not spoken to in the marketplace with any warmth. Matthew was, in the eyes of his community, one of the most hated types of people alive. And Jesus walked directly to his booth and said, "Follow me." We do not know what Matthew's face looked like in that moment. We do not know if he hesitated. We do not know if he looked around to see if anyone was watching. What we know is that he got up, left everything on that table. The coins, the ledger, the work that kept him fed, and he followed. That single act of calling Matthew tells you everything you need to know about what Jesus was building. This was not a movement for the already acceptable. This was not a club for the religiously qualified. This was something radically, uncomfortably different. Then there was Simon the Zealot. Now, if Matthew's presence in the group was surprising, Simon the Zealot's presence was almost absurd, because in the political landscape of first-century Israel, zealots were men committed to the violent overthrow of Roman occupation. They believed that collaboration with Rome was not just politically wrong, it was a sin against God. Some historians connect the zealot movement to groups who carried hidden daggers beneath their cloaks and were willing to use them. And Jesus put Simon and Matthew in the same group, the man who worked for Rome and the man who wanted to destroy Roman influence. Eating meals together, sleeping under the same roof, walking the same roads. No one would have done that. No one would have even tried. But that is exactly the point. Jesus was not building a political party. He was building something the world had never seen. A community held together not by shared politics or shared ethnicity or shared economic status, but by something deeper and more durable than any of those things. He was building a kingdom. And kingdoms, the real ones, are built on transformed hearts, not agreements between people who already like each other. Then there is the one whose name we almost cannot say without wincing. Judas Iscariot. He was there from the beginning. He heard the same teachings. He witnessed the same miracles. He was trusted enough by the group that he was given responsibility over the finances, their shared money, their communal resources. He walked the same dusty roads. He ate the same meals. He was by every external measure one of them. And yet, something in Judas was moving in a direction no one saw, or perhaps a direction that some of them sensed but could not name. His betrayal did not happen in a single dramatic moment of rage or jealousy. It was something slower, something quieter. Small compromises, small dishonesties. A growing distance between the life he was living and the message he was hearing. And then, one day, he walked into a room where Jesus' enemies were sitting, and he asked a question that would change the course of everything. "What will you give me if I deliver him to you?" 30 pieces of silver. That was the price, the same price listed in Mosaic law as the value of a slave who had been gored by an ox. 30 pieces of silver for the man who had given Judas 3 years of his life, trusted him, called him friend. We will come back to Judas, because his story is not finished with the betrayal. There is something that happened afterward, something devastating that the world tends to forget. But here is what I want you to hold on to as we move through each of these 12 men. Not one of them started out as a saint. Peter started out as a man who would panic and lie. Thomas started out as a man who needed proof. James and John started out as men so hungry for status that they asked Jesus to guarantee them the 2 best seats in his coming kingdom, and then their mother came and asked on their behalf when she thought their request might not land. These were real people, complicated people, people with ambitions and fears and blind spots and histories they were not proud of. And Jesus chose them anyway. He chose them not because of who they were, but because of who he could see they would become. That is the promise running underneath every name on this list. And it is the same promise that has been extended quietly, persistently, across 2,000 years of human history to every person who has ever felt too broken, too far gone, or too ordinary to matter. You do not have to be flawless to be chosen. You only have to be willing to follow. So Jesus had his 12. A tax collector sitting next to a revolutionary. fishermen walking beside men they would never have shared a meal with in their former lives. 12 men from 12 different corners of human experience, held together by nothing more and nothing less than the word of one man who had called them by name. But among those 12, there were 3 who were pulled even closer. Not because they were the most obedient, not because they were the most spiritually mature. If you read the record carefully, these 3 were actually the most complicated, the most volatile, and the most prone to spectacular failure of anyone in the group. And yet Jesus kept them at his side for the moments that mattered most. Peter, James, John, 3 men, 1 inner circle, and a story so full of contradiction and grace that it takes your breath away when you finally see it clearly. Let us start with Peter, because you cannot understand any of this without understanding Peter first. His original name was Simon, just Simon, a fisherman from Bethsaida working with his brother Andrew on the Sea of Galilee. Not a man of letters, not a man of religious authority. A working man who knew the water, knew the weather, and knew how to keep a boat from going under when the wind turned ugly. The first time Jesus looked at him, he said something that must have sounded almost like a joke. "You are Simon, son of John. You will be called Cephas." Cephas, Peter, the rock. And everyone who knew Simon, who had watched him react, seen him argue, heard him make promises he could not keep, would have understood the irony immediately. This man was not a rock. This man was a wave, powerful, yes, passionate, absolutely, but steady, reliable under pressure. That was not the Simon they knew. But Jesus was not describing who Peter was. He was declaring who Peter would become. That distinction would take years and one devastating failure to fully understand. Because here is what the cleaned-up version of Peter's story always leaves out. Peter was terrifying in his confidence. He was the kind of man who spoke first and felt the weight of his words later. When Jesus began telling his disciples that he would suffer and be killed, Peter grabbed him, physically took hold of him, and said, "Never, Lord, this shall never happen to you." And Jesus turned to him and said words that must have cut Peter to the bone. "Get behind me, Satan." Silence. Imagine being Peter in that moment. You reach out to protect the man you love, and he calls you by the name of the enemy. Not because Peter was evil, but because Peter's love in that moment was pulling against God's purpose. His instinct to protect was actually an obstacle to redemption. Peter did not fully understand that yet, and so he kept moving forward in his bold, impulsive, unsteady way until the night everything collapsed. The night of Jesus' arrest, Peter made one of the most dramatic promises recorded in Scripture. "Even if all fall away on account of you, I never will." He meant it, every word of it. There was no performance in that statement, no attempt to impress. Peter genuinely believed he was the one man in the group who would not break. Jesus looked at him and said quietly, "This very night before the rooster crows, you will disown me 3 times. Peter pushed back. "Even if I have to die with you, I will never disown you." And then the night unraveled. Guards came, swords appeared. Jesus was taken. The disciples scattered like leaves in a storm, and Peter, to his credit, followed. He crept into the courtyard of the high priest's house. He stayed close. He was trying to be the man he said he was. And then a servant girl looked at him across the firelight and said, "You also were with Jesus of Galilee." "I don't know what you're talking about," Peter said. "A second person. This fellow was with Jesus of Nazareth." "I don't know the man," Peter said, his voice sharper now, fear wrapping itself around every word. A third. "Surely you are one of them. Your accent gives you away." And Peter the Rock, the man who promised he would die before he denied, began to call down curses on himself, swearing with the full force of his fisherman's vocabulary that he did not know Jesus. And the rooster crowed, and Peter remembered, and he went out and wept bitterly. That moment, that dark, crumbling, humiliating moment, is one of the most important moments in the entire story. Because what happened next is where grace becomes almost unbearable in its generosity. After the resurrection, after the empty tomb and the confusion and the disbelief, Jesus appeared by the Sea of Galilee. Peter had gone back to fishing. Think about that. The man who had walked on water, who had been given the keys of the kingdom, he went back to the boat. Maybe because it was the only thing left that felt solid, the only thing he knew he could still do without failing. Jesus stood on the shore and called out to them. They came in, they ate together. And then Jesus turned to Peter and asked him a question. "Simon, son of John, do you love me?" "Yes, Lord, you know that I love you." "Feed my lambs." Again. "Simon, son of John, do you love me?" "Yes, Lord, you know that I love you." "Take care of my sheep." A third time. And here is where the weight of it lands. Peter felt hurt that Jesus asked him a third time. The repetition was not cruelty, it was precision. 3 denials, 3 restorations. Jesus was not rubbing Peter's failure in his face. He was dismantling it one question at a time, replacing each betrayal with a commission. The man who failed 3 times in the dark was being rebuilt publicly, deliberately, with love in the morning light. And that rebuilt man would go on to preach on the day of Pentecost and see 3,000 people turn to faith in a single afternoon. He would heal the sick, confront corrupt religious leaders to their faces, and stand in prison singing instead of despairing. Tradition records that Peter eventually made his way to Rome, the very heart of the empire, and preached there until Nero's persecution came for him. And when they came to crucify him, Peter made one final request. He asked to be crucified upside down. Not because he was dramatic, not because he wanted to be remembered for something unusual, but because he said, and these words are worth sitting with, that he was not worthy to die in the same position as his Lord. The man who once swore he did not know Jesus died declaring in the most costly way possible exactly who Jesus was. That is not a small arc. That is one of the most astonishing transformations in human history. Now James and John, the brothers, the sons of Zebedee. They came into the story with a different kind of fire. Jesus called them Boanerges, sons of thunder, and that was not an affectionate nickname for mild-mannered men. These brothers had tempers, they had ambition. When a Samaritan village refused to welcome Jesus, James and John turned to him and asked with complete seriousness, "Lord, do you want us to call fire down from heaven to destroy them?" They were not joking. They wanted permission to call down divine destruction on a village that had simply said no. Jesus turned and rebuked them, and they kept walking. But the ambition ran deeper than hot anger. At some point, and the Gospel of Mark includes the detail that their mother was also involved. James and John approached Jesus with a request that stunned the other 10 disciples when they heard about it. "Let one of us sit at your right and the other at your left in your glory." Power, position, the best seats in the coming kingdom. They wanted guarantees. Jesus looked at them and asked something they had not considered. "Can you drink the cup I drink or be baptized with the baptism I am baptized with?" "We can," they said. They had no idea what they were agreeing to. Jesus told them they would indeed drink that cup, but the seats, those were not his to give. The other 10 disciples heard about this request and were furious, not because they were more humble, but because they had not thought to ask first. And Jesus gathered them all together and said something that reoriented everything. "Whoever wants to become great among you must be your servant, and whoever wants to be first must be slave of all." In one quiet sentence, he turned their entire understanding of greatness upside down. James heard it, and something shifted in him. Of all the disciples, James was the first to die for his faith, not years later, not after a long ministry. James was executed by King Herod Agrippa, beheaded in what historians believe was roughly 10 years after the resurrection. He was the first apostle martyred, and he went to that death without any record of resistance, complaint, or recanting. The son of thunder died in silence, but John's transformation was slower, deeper, and in many ways more astonishing. The man who wanted to call fire from heaven eventually became the man whose entire written legacy revolves around a single word: love. He lived longer than any of the other disciples. He watched every one of his brothers in faith die for what they believed. He was eventually exiled to an island called Patmos alone, aged stripped of community, and still he wrote. Still, he declared. In one of his letters, he made a statement so simple and so profound that people have spent centuries trying to fully absorb it. God is love. Not God is powerful, not God is just, not God is victorious, though he is all of those things. God is love. The son of thunder became the apostle of love. The man who wanted to destroy a village became the man who wrote the most enduring words about the nature of God's heart. And that transformation from fire to tenderness, from rage to grace, did not happen because John tried harder. It happened because he stayed close enough long enough to be changed by what he witnessed. 3 men, 1 inner circle, and 3 lives that proved the same truth from 3 completely different directions. Jesus does not call people to stay who they are. He calls them so that who they are can finally become who they were always meant to be. So we have seen what fire looks like in Peter's collapse and restoration in James and John's rage, slowly refined into something resembling love. But here is the question nobody asks loudly enough. What about the ones who never made the headlines? Because not every disciple had a dramatic moment of failure and comeback. Not every one of them argued for the best seat or promised to die and then ran. Some of them did something quieter and in many ways harder. They simply showed up. They worked without recognition. They served without applause. And their stories, when you finally look at them closely, carry a weight that the famous moments cannot. Start with Andrew, Peter's brother, the fisherman who introduced his brother to Jesus and then spent the rest of his ministry watching that brother become the most recognized name in the early church. Think about what that actually means for a moment. Andrew was there first. Andrew was the one who heard John the Baptist point at Jesus and say, "Look, the Lamb of God." Andrew was the one who ran to find his brother and said, "We have found the Messiah." Andrew brought Peter to Jesus, and then Peter became the rock, and Andrew became a footnote. In most families, that kind of dynamic creates resentment. It creates competition. It creates the slow burn of a man who wonders privately, in the dark hours, why he was not enough to be the center of the story. But there is no record, not one verse, not one historical fragment of Andrew pulling away from his brother in jealousy. Not one moment where he positioned himself against Peter to reclaim some of the spotlight he had voluntarily handed over. Instead, Andrew kept doing exactly what he had always done. He found people. He brought them in. When thousands of people had gathered on a hillside and the disciples were panicking about how to feed them, it was Andrew who came forward, not with a solution, but with a possibility. He had found a boy in the crowd, a young boy carrying 5 small barley loaves and 2 fish. Andrew looked at what the boy had looked at, the crowd stretching out in every direction, and said to Jesus, and you can almost hear the uncertainty in his voice, "Here is a boy with 5 small barley loaves and 2 fish, but how far will they go among so many?" He knew it was not enough. He said so himself, but he brought it anyway. He put what little existed into Jesus' hands and stepped back. And Jesus fed 5,000 people. That is who Andrew was. Not the man with the answer, not the man with the strategy. The man who found what was available no matter how insufficient it looked and offered it up. That was his entire ministry in one gesture. History records that Andrew eventually traveled far beyond Israel into Greece, into the regions around the Black Sea, into what is now modern-day Turkey, and possibly even further north into the territories the Romans could barely name. He preached in places where the name of Jesus had never been spoken aloud, and in the city of Patras in Greece they arrested him. The Roman governor, a man named Aegeus, ordered Andrew crucified. But Andrew, when he saw the cross being prepared, did something that stopped everyone around him. He began speaking to it. He addressed that cross, directly calling it long desired, saying he had loved it from afar and had come to it with joy. He asked to be bound rather than nailed, so that his death would be slower, so he could preach longer. He preached from that cross for 2 days. 2 days. The man who spent his entire ministry introducing others to Jesus used his last 2 days of life to introduce strangers to him one final time. The bridge builder built one last bridge with his dying breath. Now, if Andrew's story is one of quiet faithfulness, then Philip's story is something different. It is the story of a man whose greatest weakness was also his most relatable quality. Philip was practical, logical, the kind of man who, when confronted with a problem, immediately began calculating. He looked at situations and sized them up. He was not cold, he was careful. And in the presence of Jesus, that carefulness sometimes looked like a failure of faith, but it was actually something more honest than that. When Jesus looked at the crowd gathering on that hillside, before Andrew appeared with the boy, he turned to Philip specifically and asked, "Where shall we buy bread for these people to eat?" The Gospel of John tells us something remarkable in that moment. It tells us that Jesus already knew what he was going to do. He asked Philip not because he needed the information, but because he wanted to see how Philip would respond. It was a test disguised as a question, and Philip pulled out his mental ledger. It would take more than half a year's wages to buy enough bread for each one to have a bite. Not enough. He ran the numbers and arrived at impossible. That was Philip's honest answer, not faithless, not cowardly. Honest. He looked at what he could measure and reported accurately. But here is the twist that most people miss completely. Philip did not walk away. He did not announce the impossibility and sit down. He stayed. He watched. And when Jesus took those 5 loaves and 2 fish and fed every single person on that hillside with 12 baskets left over, Philip was standing right there. He saw it with his own eyes. And still, Philip struggled with the gap between what he could reason through and what he was witnessing. At the Last Supper, just hours before everything collapsed, Philip made a request that reveals exactly who he was. He looked at Jesus and said, "Lord, show us the Father, and that will be enough for us." 3 years. 3 years of walking with Jesus, watching him heal, hearing him teach, witnessing miracles that defied every category Philip's logical mind had ever built, and Philip still needed more. Jesus looked at him with something that reads like heartbreak and patience braided together. "Have I been with you so long, Philip, and you still do not know me? Whoever has seen me has seen the Father." That question did not destroy Philip. It cracked something open in him. Because sometimes the most transformative moment is not the miracle you see with your eyes. It is the moment someone you trust looks at you and shows you that you were looking for what you already had. Philip went on. Church tradition holds that he preached across Asia Minor for decades. He died a martyr according to early Christian sources, crucified or hanged in the city of Hierapolis. His logical, practical mind finally having arrived at the one conclusion that calculation alone could never reach, that Jesus was exactly who he said he was. And then there was Nathanael, the man most of us know by his other name, Bartholomew. His entry into the story begins with a single line of skepticism, so sharp it could cut glass. Philip had just found him and was overflowing with excitement, saying that they had found the one Moses wrote about, Jesus of Nazareth, son of Joseph. Nathanael looked at him and said flatly, without apology, "Nazareth. Can anything good come from Nazareth?" I was not asking rhetorically. He meant it. Nazareth was a small, unremarkable town with no prophetic significance, no great history, no reputation worth mentioning. Nathanael had opinions, and he was not afraid to state them. This was a man with a functioning mind and a low tolerance for hype. Philip did not argue with him. He simply said, "Come and see." And Nathanael came. When Jesus saw him approaching, he said something that stopped Nathanael completely in his tracks. "Here truly is an Israelite in whom there is no deceit." Nathanael blinked. "How do you know me?" And Jesus said, and this is the moment, this is where the skeptic's armor cracks. "I saw you while you were still under the fig tree before Philip called you." Nathanael had been alone under that fig tree, completely alone. It was a private moment, a place of personal reflection. Perhaps prayer, perhaps doubt, perhaps the kind of honest wrestling with God that a man does when he thinks no one is watching. And Jesus had seen him there. not just physically, seen him, known him. The real Nathaniel, the private one, the one behind the sharp opinions and the skeptical face. And Nathaniel, this man who had just dismissed the possibility that anything good could come from Nazareth, looked at Jesus and said, "Rabbi, you are the Son of God. You are the King of Israel." He went from doubt to one of the most profound declarations in the Gospels in the span of a single conversation. Jesus smiled at him, you can feel it in the text, and said, "You believe because I told you I saw you under the fig tree. You will see greater things than that." Nathanael did. He witnessed things that no skeptic's framework could contain. Tradition holds that Bartholomew carried the gospel as far as India and possibly into Armenia. His death is recorded as one of the most brutal in all of early Christian history. He was reportedly flayed alive, his skin removed, and then crucified. The man who questioned whether anything good could come from Nazareth gave everything he had for the man from Nazareth. So here is the message underneath all three of these lives: Andrew, Philip, Nathaniel. And it is one that cuts through the noise of spectacular stories and lands somewhere quieter and more personal. Not everyone is called to be Peter. Some people are called to be Andrew, to spend their lives pointing to someone greater and never once resenting it. Some people are called to be Philip, to bring their honest doubts and their logical questions right to the feet of Jesus and trust that he can handle the questions they cannot answer. Some people are called to be Nathaniel, to start with their defenses fully raised, get seen by God in their most private moment, and let that single moment of being truly known undo every wall they ever built. The ministry of the unseen is not lesser, it is different. And the truth that threads through every one of these quieter lives is the same truth that ran through Peter's restoration, and James' death, and John's transformation. God does not need you to arrive already assembled. He just needs you to come close enough to be seen. Because the moment you are truly seen, not performed, for not managed, not the version you present to the world, but actually seen, is the moment everything can change. Nathaniel found that out under a fig tree, and he was never the same again. Nathaniel found himself seen under a fig tree, and it broke every wall he had ever built. But what happens when the wall is not built from skepticism, when it is built from something far more dangerous? What happens when the wall is built from hatred, from years of accumulated shame, from a political identity, so entrenched that the very idea of sitting beside your enemy feels like a betrayal of everything you have ever believed? That is the question that Matthew and Simon the Zealot answer together. And they answer it not with words, but with the impossible fact of their shared existence in the same circle. Start with Matthew. Because his story does not begin with his calling, it begins with what his life had already cost him before Jesus ever walked past his booth. Matthew was a Jew who collected taxes for Rome. In the social architecture of first-century Israel, that combination was not simply unpopular, it was a declaration. Every morning he sat down at that booth. He was telling his community something that he had chosen: survival over solidarity. That Roman coin mattered more to him than Jewish dignity, that he was willing to be the instrument of occupation in exchange for personal security. His neighbors knew it. His family felt it. The religious leaders cataloged it. Tax collectors in that world were not just disliked. They were ritually excluded. They could not serve as witnesses in court. They could not enter the inner courts of the temple. They were listed alongside sinners and prostitutes in the religious vocabulary of the day, a grouping designed not merely to describe, but to diminish. Matthew had been reduced to a category. He had become, in the eyes of his world, less than a person and more than a problem. And he sat in that reduction every single day. What went through his mind during those hours at the booth, we can only imagine. Did he tell himself it was just work? Did he go home at night and try to remember who he had been before the compromise? Did he believe somewhere underneath the armor that a man builds when his community has turned its back on him, that he was beyond recovery? We do not know. What we know is that one afternoon Jesus walked past that booth. Not hurrying, not averting his eyes the way most religious people did when they passed a tax collector. He stopped. He looked directly at Matthew, not at the booth, not at the coins, not at the ledger, at the man. And he said 2 words, "Follow me." No lecture about the corruption of the Roman tax system. No requirement to first make restitution. No probationary period. No list of conditions. Just an invitation spoken directly to a man that polite society had long since written off. Matthew got up. The text moves so fast at this point that it is easy to miss what is actually happening. Matthew did not say, "Let me think about it." He did not ask, "What will this cost me?" He stood up from the only security he had ever successfully built for himself and walked away from it without looking back. That evening, Matthew threw a party, a large one, and the guest list was, to put it gently, not what any respectable rabbi would have endorsed. Tax collectors, sinners, people who lived on the edges and in the shadows of acceptable society. Matthew had only one world left, and he threw open the door of it and invited everyone he knew to come. Meet the man who had spoken to him without flinching. The Pharisees saw this and went directly to the disciples with a question soaked in contempt. "Why does your teacher eat with tax collectors and sinners?" Jesus heard it, and his answer was not defensive, it was surgical. "It is not the healthy who need a doctor, but the sick. Go and learn what this means. I desire mercy, not sacrifice, for I have not come to call the righteous, but sinners." Go and learn what this means. I was quoting their own scripture back at them. He was telling them that the mercy they had memorized, but never absorbed, was standing right in front of them, eating dinner with people they had thrown away. Matthew heard that, and something in him that had been clenched for years began slowly, painfully to open. That man, the one society had reduced to a category, went on to write one of the 4 accounts of Jesus' life that has survived 2,000 years. The Gospel of Matthew, read in every language, carried into every nation. The rejected man became the recorder of the most important life ever lived. But now we have to talk about who was sitting across the table, because Simon the Zealot was also in that circle. And the distance between Matthew and Simon was not merely personal. It was ideological, political, and in the violent climate of first-century Judea, potentially lethal. The Zealots were not a fringe movement. They were men who believed with every fiber of their being that Roman occupation was a spiritual abomination, that collaboration with Rome was sin, and that the liberation of Israel was worth any price, including blood. Some zealot-adjacent groups carried hidden blades. Some had already used them. The idea that a zealot and a tax collector could occupy the same physical space without one of them trying to destroy the other was, by the social logic of their world, absurd. And yet, here they were, in the same group, walking the same roads, sleeping under the same roof, eating from the same bowl. Did they argue? Almost certainly. Did Simon look at Matthew sometimes with an old contempt trying to resurface? Did Matthew feel the weight of Simon's judgment, the way he had felt the judgment of everyone else? Did they have moments, private tense, away from the others, where the old world tried to pull them back into its divisions? Probably. Almost certainly. Because they were human. But they stayed. And that staying, that daily grinding, unglamorous choice to remain in community with someone your entire history has taught you to oppose is itself a miracle. Not the kind that happens in a single dramatic moment. The kind that happens slowly, invisibly, in the accumulated weight of shared experience. Jesus did not smooth over the tension between them. He put them together and let the transformation do its work. Because the kingdom he was building could not be built by people who only loved those who were easy to love. Now there were others in that 12 whose names the world has nearly forgotten, and their silence in the record carries its own kind of message. James, the son of Alphaeus, not James, the brother of John. A different James, a quieter James, a man who appears on every list of the 12 and almost nowhere else in the record. No dramatic moment, no recorded dialogue, no story of failure or spectacular recovery, just a name written 4 times across the Gospels and Acts on every list of the 12. He was there. That is what we know. He was there for all of it, the teachings, the miracles, the Last Supper, Gethsemane, the resurrection appearances. He was present for the greatest events in human history, and he left no memoir, no famous quote, no recorded act of heroism. He was simply faithful, consistently, quietly, invisibly faithful. And then there was Thaddeus, also called Judas, son of James, not to be confused with Judas Iscariot, a man whose one recorded moment in the Gospels is a question asked at the Last Supper, a question so honest it could only come from someone paying very close attention. Jesus had been speaking about revealing himself to those who loved him, and Thaddeus leaned in and asked, "Lord, why do you intend to show yourself to us and not to the world?" It was a real question, a human question. The kind of question a man asks when he is genuinely trying to understand a plan that does not yet make sense to him. He was not doubting, he was not challenging, he was reaching. And Jesus answered him, patiently, personally. That one question tells you something about who Thaddeus was. A man who paid attention, who thought carefully, who was not afraid to admit when he did not fully understand. The world does not remember him the way it remembers Peter or John. But God remembered him, and that the story keeps insisting is the only record that finally matters. And now we have arrived at the name we have been circling since the beginning. Judas Iscariot. There is a temptation when we talk about Judas to make him a monster, to draw him as a villain from the first scene, shifty-eyed, calculating, wearing his betrayal like a coat from the moment he entered the story. It is a temptation we should resist, because the Judas the historical record gives us is far more disturbing than a simple villain. He was trusted. That is the detail that should stop you cold. Judas carried the money. He held the common purse for 12 men who had left their livelihoods behind. You do not give that responsibility to someone you do not trust. The other disciples did not suspect him, not until the very last moment, when Jesus identified him at the table. And even then, some of them thought Jesus was telling Judas to go buy something they needed for the festival. They did not see it coming, which means Judas was not performing betrayal from a distance. He was present. He was engaged. He participated in every conversation, every meal, every moment of ministry. He watched the same miracles Philip struggled to categorize. He heard the same teachings that cracked Nathanael open. He was there for the feeding of 5,000, for the transfiguration, for the resurrection of Lazarus. He saw all of it, and something in him remained untouched. The Gospel of John records that Judas had been stealing from the common purse. Small amounts, quietly, over time. And that detail is not incidental, it is diagnostic. Because betrayal rarely announces itself. It starts small. A compromise here, a rationalization there, a slow, incremental drift between the life you are living publicly and the hunger you are feeding privately. When Judas walked into the meeting with the chief priests and asked, "What are you willing to give me if I deliver him to you?" He did not arrive at that room in one step. He walked to it across 1,000 small choices, each one pulling him a little further from the man who had called him by name. 30 pieces of silver. And the moment it was in his hands, something shifted in him. Because when the arrest was over and the trial had begun, and Jesus was being led toward his death, Judas came back to the chief priests and threw the money at their feet. "I have sinned," he said. "I have betrayed innocent blood." They looked at him with cold indifference. "What is that to us? That's your responsibility." And in that moment, Judas discovered the most devastating truth a person can learn from the wrong side. The people who used him had no use for his remorse. They had taken what they needed and left him alone with what he had done. He threw the silver into the temple and went out. And he did not come back. The tragedy of Judas is not simply that he betrayed Jesus. It is that he chose despair over the possibility of return. Peter denied Jesus and wept and came back. Judas betrayed Jesus, felt the full weight of it, and decided that what he had done was too far gone for grace to reach. He was wrong, but he never found that out. And that gap between Peter's return and Judas' departure is perhaps the most searching question this entire story puts to every person who hears it. When you have failed in the darkest way, you know how to fail. Do you believe you can come back? Because the answer Jesus gave Peter at the shoreline, the patient 3 times repeated relentless offer of restoration, was not just for Peter. It was for anyone willing to turn around. The question Judas never let himself ask, whether grace could still reach him, hung over everything that came next. Because after the cross, after the empty tomb, after the resurrection appearances, that left the remaining disciples oscillating between terror and overwhelming joy, there was a problem that no one had spoken aloud yet. There were only 11 of them, the number that Jesus had prayed over all night before, choosing that deliberate, specific, sacred number of 12 had a hole in it. And that hole was not just practical, it was painful. Every time they gathered in a room together, every time they counted heads, Every time someone instinctively moved to make space for a person who was no longer there, the absence pressed in. So they prayed, and they chose. Matthias was selected to take the place of Judas, a man who had walked with Jesus from the very beginning, from the baptism of John all the way to the ascension, and had been faithful every step of the way, without ever being elevated to the inner 12. He had served without recognition for the entire length of Jesus' ministry. He had done the work of a disciple without the title of an apostle. And now, in the moment when the number needed to be restored, Matthias stepped forward, not with ambition, but with readiness. The mission did not pause for grief, it continued, because that was always the nature of what Jesus had started. It was not built around any single personality or any irreplaceable individual. It was built around a truth that could not be killed, a resurrection that could not be undone, and a spirit that was about to do something. None of them had the vocabulary to describe yet. And then came the day of Pentecost. Peter the same. Peter, who had stood in a courtyard and sworn 3 times that he did not know Jesus, stood up in Jerusalem in front of thousands of people from every nation gathered for the festival, and he opened his mouth and he preached. Not quietly, not carefully, not with the hedging language of a man still managing his reputation. He preached with everything he had. He told them directly that the Jesus they had crucified was the Lord, the Messiah, the one that God had raised from the dead. 3,000 people turned to faith that day. 3,000. From a man who weeks earlier could not admit knowing Jesus to a servant girl by a fire. That is not a small detail. That is the entire argument compressed into one life. That is the proof that what Jesus had been doing in these men for 3 years was not just teaching, it was rebuilding. It was reconstruction at a level so deep that failure itself became part of the foundation. But this is where the story takes a turn that most people in comfortable, peaceful lives are not fully prepared for. Because the growth of the early church did not come with safety. It came with a target on every back in that upper room. James was the first to find out what that target meant. King Herod Agrippa moved against the early church, not out of personal theological objection, but because persecution was politically useful. It pleased a crowd. It demonstrated authority. And James, the son of thunder, the man who had once asked Jesus for the best seat in the coming kingdom, was arrested and executed, beheaded quickly, without a long trial or a dramatic last speech recorded in the text, just gone. When the other disciples heard it, the silence must have been suffocating. James was not a peripheral figure. He was the inner circle. He was one of the 3 men who had stood on the mountain of transfiguration and seen Jesus' face shine like the sun. He was one of the 3 who had knelt in Gethsemane while Jesus sweat drops of blood. And now he was dead, and the church was still only years old, and the question that must have pressed against every heart in that room was the same question. Human beings have always asked when someone faithful dies too soon, was it worth it? And the answer they gave, not in words, but in what they did next, was yes. Unequivocally, at extraordinary personal cost, yes. Peter kept preaching and was arrested again. He was beaten. He was imprisoned. He was told to stop, and he looked his captors in the face and said, "Judge for yourselves whether it is right in God's sight to obey you rather than God. We cannot help speaking about what we have seen and heard." He did not whisper it. He said it directly to the men who held the power to kill him. This was the same man who could not speak up for Jesus beside a fire when a servant girl asked him a simple question. The transformation was not theoretical. It was lived, tested, and proven under conditions that would have broken most people completely. Now here is the twist that the comfortable version of this story always skips over, because the deaths of these men were not quiet. They were not peaceful departures in warm beds, surrounded by people who loved them. These were violent ends that the early church recorded not as tragedies, but as testimonies. Philip, the practical man who ran the numbers and always arrived at impossible, was eventually crucified in the city of Hierapolis. By that point, Philip had preached across Asia Minor for decades. He had watched the gospel move through cultures and languages that he could not have imagined when he was calculating the cost of bread on a hillside in Galilee. And when the death came, the logical man met it with the faith he had spent a lifetime learning to trust more than his own arithmetic. Bartholomew Nathaniel, the skeptic who asked whether anything good could come from Nazareth, died in one of the most brutal ways recorded in early Christian history. He was flayed alive, his skin removed, and then crucified. The specifics are recorded not to satisfy morbid curiosity, but because the early church understood something that we in comfortable centuries have largely forgotten. The manner of a martyr's death was a testimony in itself. Nathaniel, who had built his walls so carefully around his heart, died with those walls completely gone open to the end, giving everything for the man who had seen him under a fig tree and called him by his truest name. Thomas traveled furthest of all. The man history has labeled a doubter unfairly, incompletely carried the gospel east across Persia and into India. There are Christian communities in the southern Indian state of Kerala today, ancient communities that trace their origin back not to European missionaries, but to Thomas himself, who arrived on that shore and began to speak. He built a church there, not a building, a people. He planted faith in a soil that no other apostle reached. And according to tradition, he was killed by being run through with a spear on a hill near what is now the city of Chennai. The man who needed to put his finger in the nail marks before he would believe that man went to the furthest edge of the known world and gave his life for what he had eventually chosen to believe with everything he had. Andrew, who had spent 2 days preaching from a cross in Patras, was gone. Matthew, who had left his tax booth for an invitation he could not explain, had carried that story into the ancient world before his death. Tradition places his martyrdom in Ethiopia. Simon the Zealot, the revolutionary who had learned to share a table with a man he would have once considered a traitor, preached across Persia and died there. James, the son of Alphaeus, the quiet one, the consistently faithful one whose name appears on every list and whose story the Gospels never dramatized, gone. Thaddeus, who had asked his honest question at the Last Supper, gone. Matthias, who had waited faithfully without recognition for years before being called, gone. One by one, the 11 became 10, became 9, became fewer. And each departure was a door, not a wall. Each death was a seed, not an ending. And John watched all of it. John, the last of the inner 3, the son of thunder, who had become the apostle of love, outlived every single one of his brothers. He watched them go, James first, then the others one by one across the decades. He was arrested. He was reportedly thrown into boiling oil and survived, and then he was exiled, sent to the island of Patmos alone. aged stripped of every community he had ever loved. And on that island, in that isolation, he did not go silent. He wrote, he heard, and he saw, and he recorded what became the book of Revelation, a vision of the end of all things and the beginning of something that could not be destroyed. And before that, he had written letters that circled back again and again to the one thing he had come to understand more deeply than any doctrine or theology or church structure. Love one another, not as a suggestion, as a command, as the very center of what it meant to follow the one they had followed. He was the only apostle to die of old age, and the tradition says that in his final years, when he was too frail to preach, he would be carried into gatherings of believers, and he would say the same thing every time, over and over, until the people around him asked why he kept repeating it. And John would look at them, this ancient man, this last living link to the inner circle, this son of thunder, who had become something else entirely. And he would say, "Because it is the commandment of the Lord, and if it alone is kept, it is enough. Love one another." That was the last word of the last man standing. So here is what 12 ordinary lives add up to. Here is what the fisherman and the tax collector and the skeptic and the revolutionary and the quiet faithful ones and the doubter who went furthest here is what all of it means when you hold it together. Not one of them was chosen because he was already the person he needed to become. Every single one of them was chosen in his unfinished, complicated, thoroughly human condition. And every single one of them, except the one who chose to leave, was transformed by what he stayed close to. The angry became tender, the fearful became fearless, the calculating became surrendered, the rejected became the recorders, the skeptics became the furthest travelers, the quiet ones became the faithful foundation. Nobody bothered to celebrate, but nobody could build without. And the one who doubted most loudly, he went the furthest. That is the answer to the question this story has been building toward since the beginning. The question of whether broken people can carry something beautiful without destroying it. They can. Not because they are strong enough, but because what they are carrying is stronger than their weakness. 2,000 years have passed since a man walked along the shore of a lake in northern Israel and said 2 words to a fisherman who smelled like his work. The empires that crucified these men are gone. The governments that exiled them are dust. The religious authorities who condemned their teacher could not stop what he started. And the story is still being told, not because 12 men were perfect, but because one grace was greater than 12 imperfections. God does not call the qualified. He qualifies those who answer. And the same voice that called Peter from his nets, that called Matthew from his booth, that called Nathanael from beneath his fig tree, that same voice has been calling across every generation since. The only question that has ever mattered is the one it leaves with you now. What will you do when you hear your name